At my daughter's wedding, her biological father showed up uninvited and shouted, "I'm taking her back." Her response left him, and the entire crowd, speechless. I never thought I'd have to deal with Travis again, let alone at my daughter's wedding. In my wildest nightmares, he was nowhere in the picture. I'd had Savannah's whole wedding planned in my mind for years without him. This was supposed to be a day of joy, pride, and celebration. But life has a way of sneaking up on you, and, apparently, so does a past you thought you'd left behind. Let me back up. Savannah was my world, my only child, and the light that carried me through some of the darkest days of my life. Her father, Travis, and I divorced before she even hit kindergarten. And, truth be told, it was the best decision I ever made. Travis wasn't a bad person per se, he could be sweet, even funny when he wanted to be. But he had his demons, and by the time Savannah was born, those demons had dug their claws deep into him. A part of me once hoped he would get better. I believed in that version of him when we got married, and a small, stupid part of me thought maybe he'd step up once he had a little girl to care for. But Travis only seemed to get worse as time went on. So I left, packed up Savannah and me, and moved 2 states over to Charleston, South Carolina. It was here that I met Rick, the man I'd eventually marry and who became the true father to Savannah in every way that mattered. And now here we were, 24 years later, standing in a Charleston wedding suite, getting my daughter ready to marry the love of her life, a sweet guy named Ethan. Savannah and Ethan met during nursing school, and I'd never seen her happier or more at peace with someone. As I zipped her into her wedding dress, I watched her reflection in the mirror. Her face was beaming, a mix of excitement and nerves all rolled into one. She looked like the perfect bride, glowing and elegant, and yet so grounded, like she knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. "You okay, honey?" I asked, giving her shoulder a squeeze. She took a deep breath, nodding. "Yeah. It's all hitting me now. I'm getting married." Her best friend, Mara, laughed from across the room. "You better be ready, girl. Ethan's probably downstairs sweating through his tux." We all chuckled, and Savannah grinned, relaxing a bit. The photographer was snapping photos while we were making last-minute adjustments to her dress, the room bustling with excitement and chatter. Rick was down with the groomsmen, probably making sure they all had their boutonnieres on straight. Everything was perfect. Or at least, it was until the knock on the door. It wasn't the polite kind of knock you'd expect from a photographer or one of the caterers. It was loud, insistent, like someone was in a hurry to get in. Savannah glanced over, frowning. "Who is that?" Mara went to open the door, and in walked Travis. The room fell silent. I couldn't believe my eyes. The man who'd disappeared from our lives years ago was standing right here, in the middle of my daughter's wedding suite, looking, well, rough. I felt my throat tighten. He'd aged, and not well. His hair was thinning, his face looked sunken, and he wore this worn-out suit that hung on him like it belonged to someone else. Savannah's makeup artist dropped a brush. Mara stood there, frozen, eyes wide. And Savannah? She looked like she was staring at a ghost. He broke the silence first. "Savannah," he said, his voice raspy. It's you." She stared at him, mouth slightly open, like she was trying to process whether this was even real. She hadn't seen him in person since she was a little girl, and I'd only kept a couple of photos of him tucked away for her. I'd never spoken ill of him to her, never wanted to fill her head with the bitterness that I'd spent years working to let go of, but I could see the confusion, even anger, in her eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice steady, even though her hands were shaking. He stepped toward her, ignoring the tension in the room. I heard you were getting married. I wanted to be here for you, Savannah. I'm your father." That word, father, hung in the air like a bad smell. Rick was the only father Savannah had ever known. He was the one who taught her to ride a bike, the one who held her when she cried over heartbreaks and homework stresses. Travis, he'd only been there at the start, and even that was spotty. Savannah didn't break her gaze. "You don't get to call yourself that," she said quietly, and her words felt like they were cutting right through him. "You left, Travis. You left a long time ago." His face fell, but then he tried to smile, as if that could fix everything. "I know, darlin'. I made mistakes, big ones. But I want to be here now. I want to be in your life again." Rick came in just then, and the minute he saw Travis, his whole expression changed. He stepped over to Savannah, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "You need to leave," Rick said, his voice steady but with a warning edge to it. Travis laughed, though it sounded more bitter than amused. "I don't think so. I'm her father," he said, glancing at Rick with a sneer. "You might have played daddy for a while, but I'm her blood." "You're nothing to me," Savannah shot back, her voice louder now. "Rick is my dad. He's been there my whole life." "Where were you?" Travis looked taken aback, but his face quickly twisted with anger. "They took you from me," he spat, glaring in my direction. "Your mother, she poisoned you against me. Kept me out of your life." I felt the anger flare up inside me. "You walked away, Travis," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. You chose alcohol and whatever else over us. Don't you dare put this on me. Savannah looked at him with a mix of disgust and pity. I gave up waiting for you a long time ago. I'm happy now. I have a family. This is my wedding day, and you're ruining it. Just go. But he didn't budge. Instead, he raised his voice. You don't know the truth, Savannah. I didn't abandon you, I was pushed out. Rick's not your father, no matter how much he plays the part. I'm your real dad, and I want to be part of your life again. You're still my little girl. Savannah's face turned red, and tears started brimming in her eyes. She clenched her fists. Don't you dare try to guilt trip me. You think you can just show up and pretend like all those years didn't happen? Like you didn't leave me wondering what was wrong with me? Well, I'm not your little girl anymore. I'm Rick's daughter, and I'm marrying Ethan today, and you need to leave. But he didn't move. If anything, he looked even more determined. I'm taking her back, he muttered, almost to himself. I'm taking you back, Savannah. We're going to be a family again. At that, Rick stepped forward, his voice low and deadly calm. You heard her. This is her day. Leave now, or I'll have security escort you out. Travis opened his mouth to argue, but he saw the resolve in Rick's eyes. For a moment, he looked defeated, as if he finally realized he'd lost whatever fantasy he'd been holding on to. With a last, bitter glare, he turned and walked out, muttering something under his breath. The second he was gone, Savannah crumpled into my arms, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered. I'm sorry he ruined everything. I held her close, brushing her hair back and soothing her the way I had when she was a little girl. No, honey. You have nothing to apologize for. He showed you who he really is, and you handled it better than anyone else could have. The rest of the day was a bit of a blur. We all put on brave faces, though the encounter with Travis lingered like a shadow over the ceremony. But when Savannah walked down the aisle, all eyes on her, she shone. She was strong, beautiful, and resolute, and I knew that no matter what ghosts from the past tried to drag her down, she'd be okay. She had us, her real family, standing beside her. In the end, we danced, we laughed, and we celebrated Savannah's marriage. And I knew that as long as we had each other, nothing, certainly not Travis, could take that away from us. By the time the wedding festivities wound down, Travis was the last thing on anyone's mind, or so I thought. I had hoped his appearance had been a one-off, a fluke that we could chalk up to his troubled life catching up with him. But the reality, I soon found out, was that Travis had left a much bigger mess in his wake than I could have imagined. And his reappearance was only the beginning. 2 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from an unknown number. Figuring it was one of those endless telemarketers, I was ready to hang up until a voice I recognized crackled through the line. Hey, it's Travis, he said, as if we were old friends catching up. I gripped the phone tighter, my stomach sinking. Travis, what do you want? There was a pause, and then a dark chuckle. I think you know. That phone call was the start of a campaign of harassment I never saw coming. Travis, it turned out, was furious. Not just at being rejected by Savannah, but by the fact that we'd moved on without him and that Rick had taken on the role he'd abandoned so easily. He was on a mission to reclaim the family he'd lost, and that meant stepping up his game in the most invasive ways possible. For starters, he showed up at Rick's workplace. Rick was used to dealing with all kinds of stressful situations. His job as a structural engineer had him constantly navigating high-stakes projects. But having Travis barge in, loudly demanding to speak with the man who stole his daughter in front of his colleagues? That was a whole different level of personal attack. Rick called me immediately afterward, his voice tight with anger. We can't let this go on, Alice. He's unhinged. But it didn't stop there. Travis somehow found Savannah's new address. She and Ethan had just moved into a cozy little townhouse, ready to start their life as newlyweds. One day, while Ethan was at work, Savannah heard a knock at her door, only to find Travis standing on the front steps, looking even more worn out and wild-eyed than he had at the wedding. Savannah, please, just let me talk to you, he pleaded, his tone desperate. I just want to be in your life, that's all. Savannah, bless her heart, stood her ground. You lost that right a long time ago. Don't come here again. But the next day, there he was again, this time with a bouquet of wilting flowers and a rambling speech about redemption and family bonds. Savannah finally called the police, who escorted him away with a warning. But that did little to deter him. He started calling, leaving voicemail after voicemail, each one more desperate, more incoherent than the last. It was like he'd become obsessed, and nothing we said or did would get him to back down. Rick and I knew we had to take action. I started researching options, finding out everything I could about restraining orders, protective measures, anything that would keep Travis at bay. Meanwhile, Savannah was a wreck, her newlywed bliss shattered by this haunting presence from her past. And that's when Rick came up with a plan, something that, honestly, I wouldn't have had the nerve to even consider. But desperate times called for desperate measures. We're going to give him a taste of his own medicine, Rick said one night as we sat around our kitchen table. It's time he knows exactly what it feels like to be haunted. It wasn't immediate, and it required a bit of planning. But over the next few weeks, Rick used every connection he had, reaching out to friends, former colleagues, and even a couple of local private investigators. And slowly, piece by piece, we started to dismantle the fantasy Travis had built around himself. For starters, Rick's friend managed to dig up Travis's credit report, and it wasn't pretty. Turns out, he was buried under a mountain of debt, owing everything from unpaid rent to overdue credit card bills. The kind of debt that, if exposed to the right people, would make his life even harder. Rick didn't do anything illegal with this information, but we made sure that every landlord within miles knew about Travis's history. If he wanted to keep finding a place to live, he was going to have to face his own failures. Then there were his employers. I'll admit, I didn't think Travis even had a job, but apparently, he'd managed to hold down a low-level position at a construction company. Rick's contacts in the industry spread the word, sharing the details of his erratic behavior, his history with the law, and his recent harassment. Word got around quickly, and within a month, he'd lost his job. We didn't feel a shred of guilt. If he wanted to terrorize our family, he'd have to pay the price. But the real blow came when Rick hired a lawyer. Travis had avoided child support for years, dodging every payment and every court notice. Now, with Savannah grown and independent, he thought he was in the clear. But as it turned out, our lawyer had a loophole up his sleeve. Since Travis had essentially abandoned his financial responsibilities for nearly 2 decades, he still owed Savannah's unpaid support, plus interest. It was a substantial amount, one that Travis would be expected to pay back in installments, garnished from any income he managed to scrape together. When Travis received that notice, he showed up at our house, banging on the door so hard I thought he'd break it down. "You're ruining me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I have nothing left. You took my family and now my money." Rick opened the door just enough to look him in the eye, his face calm and unyielding. "You did this to yourself, Travis. You left us. You turned your back on Savannah and me, and now you're paying the consequences. It's time you stopped blaming everyone else." Travis was shaking with rage, his face twisted in anger. "This isn't over, Rick. I'll make you all pay for this." Rick didn't flinch. "Oh, it's over, Travis. If you come near Savannah, me, or Alice again, I'll make sure the next people you talk to are the police." For a long moment, Travis just stood there, his face dark with frustration, but he knew he was cornered. He spat on the ground and turned, stumbling down the front steps without another word. After that day, we didn't see or hear from him again. Savannah was finally able to settle into her new life with Ethan, without the constant shadow of fear hanging over her. Rick and I had secured a future for her that Travis could no longer touch. We'd given him every chance to walk away with dignity, but he'd chosen to dig his own grave. And in the end, the best revenge was that we moved forward, while he was left facing the very demons he'd tried to thrust upon us. Now, when I look at Savannah and her husband, happy and in love, I know that we did what needed to be done. Travis had tried to tear us down, but instead, he'd only strengthened the family he'd once abandoned. And as we sat together for dinner on a quiet evening, Savannah turned to me with a soft smile, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thanks, Mom. For everything," she said, reaching for my hand. I squeezed it, my heart swelling with pride and peace. "Anything for you, Savannah. Anything."